The hall was enormous, stretching so far in every direction that light itself seemed to grow tired before reaching the walls. And inside that hall sat the representatives of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations, each one older and more powerful than the last, each one convinced of its own importance in the grand machine of the galaxy. This was the Galactic Concord, the seat of power for every known species that had crawled out of its homeworld and touched the stars. And at the center of it all, raised above the rest on a platform of black crystal, sat the Valith Dominion. The oldest, the strongest, the ones who had written the rules that everyone else followed. Today was listing day. It came once every galactic cycle, and it was the day the Dominion released the harvest list, a simple document, short and cold, that named every primitive world in the galaxy that had been selected for conquest, and no one in the chamber treated it as anything remarkable, because it had happened 1,000 times before, and it would happen 1,000 times again. The Dominion delegate, a tall figure wrapped in dark metallic robes, stood and began reading the names in a voice that carried no emotion at all, just the flat sound of someone reading a grocery list. Vorath 7, Tier 4, Pre-Warp Industrial Civilization, Estimated Resistance, Moderate, Recommended Fleet Size, 12 capital ships. A few delegates nodded. Sin Okara, Tier 6, Aquatic Pre-Contact Species, Estimated Resistance, Minimal, Recommended Fleet Size, 4 capital ships. No one even looked up. The list went on and on, world after world, species after species, lives measured in numbers and filed away like inventory. And no one in the hall questioned it, because this was how things had always been done. The strong survived, and the weak were harvested, and the Dominion had never once been wrong about which was which. Then the delegate read a name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Sol 3, locally known as Earth, Tier 9, Pre-Warp Fragmented Civilization, Estimated Resistance, Negligible, Recommended Fleet Size, 1 Scout Carrier. A few delegates laughed. Tier 9 was the lowest possible classification, reserved for species so primitive and so divided that they barely qualified as a civilization at all. And the fact that the Dominion was only sending a single scout carrier made it clear just how little they thought of whatever lived on that small blue world, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the outer arm of the galaxy. The delegate moved on to the next name without pausing, and Earth was forgotten before the echo of the word had even faded from the chamber walls. In the upper galleries, a trade delegate from the Karathi Federation leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Another Tier 9. They will probably surrender before the fleet even arrives." And his colleague shrugged. Reviewing shipping contracts, because that was how unimportant Earth was to the rest of the galaxy, less interesting than cargo manifests. Across the galaxy, aboard a warship the size of a small moon, Archon Sevrath Cole received his orders and barely reacted. He was the Dominion's most decorated fleet commander, a conqueror of over 300 worlds, a being who had watched civilizations crumble and burn and beg and break, and he had done it all with the calm efficiency of someone doing a job that no longer required thought. Earth was nothing to him. He pulled up the file on Sol 3 and skimmed through it with the kind of attention a person gives to junk mail. Population of 8 billion. No unified government. No planetary defense grid. No faster-than-light capability. Currently still burning fossil fuels for energy and fighting each other over invisible lines drawn on maps. He almost laughed. "Send the scouting swarm," he ordered his second-in-command. "And prepare a standard pacification timeline. I want this finished before the next cycle. I have real targets waiting." His second-in-command, a young officer named Tyrell Voss, nodded and transmitted the order. And within hours, a cloud of 10,000 tiny drones launched from the carrier's belly and shot across the galaxy toward Sol system at speeds that would have shattered human understanding of physics. They arrived in silence. The drones spread out through the solar system like invisible dust, slipping past the outer planets, drifting through the asteroid belt, settling into orbit around the third planet from the sun. And they began to watch. They watched everything. They cataloged every military base, every weapon system, every satellite, every ship, every submarine beneath every ocean. And the numbers were so small and so primitive that the drone AI flagged the entire species as a non-threat within the first 6 hours. Recorded the radio chatter, the news broadcasts, the music, the arguments, the prayers, and they analyzed the psychological profile of the species with cold precision. Fractured social structure, the report read, over 190 competing tribal governments, no central authority, deep internal divisions, along ideological and ethnic lines, high levels of intraspecies violence, species appears primarily occupied with self-destruction, no external awareness, no preparation for contact, no threat detected, recommends standard pacification protocol. The drones transmitted their findings back to Archon Kull's ship, and he reviewed them the way a chef reviews the ingredients for a meal he has cooked 1,000 times, with boredom. But deep in the data, buried in the noise of 1 billion radio signals and the static of a chaotic little world, one of the drones had picked up something unusual. It was a signal, old and faint, coming not from Earth itself, but from a tiny object, drifting at the very edge of the solar system. A small metal probe covered in gold, spinning slowly through the dark, broadcasting a message on repeat into the endless void. The drone AI flagged it, analyzed it for exactly 2 seconds, classified it as primitive cultural noise with no strategic value, and deleted the flag. The report went back clean. No anomalies, no threats, no surprises. Just another helpless world waiting to be taken, another name on a list that would soon be crossed off and forgotten. On Earth, the sun set over 1,000 cities, and children played in streets that would soon be targeted for bombardment. And scientists stared through telescopes at stars that were already staring back at them, and not a single human being on that entire spinning world had any idea that their planet had just been sentenced to death by a government they would never know existed. And out at the edge of their little solar system, spinning, in the cold and the silence, the golden probe kept broadcasting its message. A message that no one in the galaxy had bothered to truly hear. Not yet. On the far edge of the galaxy, past the trade lanes and the war zones and the glittering empires that stretched across 1,000,000 stars, there was a world that most species had forgotten even existed. It was called Anthira, and it was old. Not old the way the Dominion was old, not old the way mountains are old, but old the way the darkness between stars is old, the kind of old that makes everything else feel like it was born yesterday. The Anthiri had been watching the galaxy since before most civilizations had learned to make fire, and in all that time they had chosen to do almost nothing with their power, which was considerable, because the Anthiri had learned something that younger species never seemed to understand, that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not strength, but attention. They kept to themselves, they observed, they recorded, and they never ever got involved. Until the day the harvest list reached their world. Sitting in the deep chamber beneath the surface of Anthira when the document arrived, transmitted through channels so old that most species did not even know they still functioned. And he read through the names the way he always did, with sadness but without surprise, because the Dominion had been doing this for as long as he could remember, and the Anthiri had never once intervened. Then he saw the name Sol 3. His hand stopped moving. His 4 eyes, pale and ancient, and usually so calm that younger Anthiri joked they were made of glass, went wide, and for the first time in over 1,000 years, Elder Corvan stood up from his chair, with something that looked very much like fear. He read the entry again, slowly, carefully, hoping he had made a mistake. Sol 3, locally known as Earth, Tier 9, recommended fleet size, 1 scout carrier. He closed the file and sat in silence for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the chamber walls barely caught it. They have no idea what they are about to wake up. Within hours, the Antheri did something they had not done in 3,000 years. They sent a formal request to the Galactic Concord for an emergency session, and the request was so unexpected that half the Concord delegates assumed it was a mistake or a joke, because the Antheri asking to speak was like a mountain asking to dance. It simply did not happen. But the request was real, and the rules of the Concord were clear, and so the session was granted. When Corvan arrived at the Concord chamber, the hall was buzzing with confused whispers, because no living delegate had ever actually seen an Antheri representative in person, and Corvan was not what they expected. He was small, quiet, wrapped in simple gray cloth, with no guards and no weapons and no display of power, and he walked to the center of the chamber with the slow, careful steps of someone who had been walking for a very long time. The Dominion delegate watched from the high platform with open contempt. The Antheri wished to speak, the moderator announced, and the chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Corvan looked up at the thousands of faces staring down at him, and he spoke in a voice that was soft but carried to every corner of that enormous room. You must remove Earth from the harvest list, immediately. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before it shattered into laughter. The Karathi delegate shook his head. The Dominion representative actually smiled, and a dozen other species made sounds that roughly translated to amusement across their various biologies. Because the idea that anyone, especially a reclusive old hermit from the edge of the galaxy, would stand before the Concord and demand protection for a Tier 9 world was simply absurd. On what grounds? The Dominion delegate asked, still smiling, and the question was not sincere. The kind of question a predator asks its prey to enjoy the answer. Corvan did not flinch. On the grounds that my people have been watching that world for longer than most of you have existed, and I am telling you now, with absolute certainty, that if you attack Earth, you will set in motion a chain of events that will end with the destruction of everything in this room. The laughter stopped, not because they believed him, but because the way he said it was so calm and so certain that it made the air in the chamber feel heavier. We watched them, Corvan continued, for thousands of their years. We watched them from the very beginning, and what we saw was something we had never encountered in any other species in this galaxy, not in the Dominion, not in the Korathi, not in any of the 4,000 civilizations represented here. He paused and looked directly at the Dominion delegate. They do not break. He let the words settle before continuing. Every species we have ever studied reaches a point of collapse, a threshold of suffering beyond which they simply stop. They surrender. They accept. They go quiet. They die. And that is the natural order of things. That is what makes the harvest list possible, because every world on that list will eventually kneel. His voice grew harder. Humans do not kneel. They burn and they bleed and they lose everything, and they bury their dead, and then they stand back up and they build again. And they have done this over and over for their entire history. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times, in ways that our models cannot explain and our projections cannot contain. The chamber was completely silent now. They split the atom, Corvan said, not for energy, not for science. They split it to build a weapon, and then they used that weapon on themselves, on their own kind. And then do you know what they did after that? They did not collapse. They did not retreat into despair. They took that same power and they used it to light their cities and heal their sick, and push their ships across their oceans. And they did it within a single generation. He turned slowly, looking at every section of the gallery. They went to their moon, he said, not because it was easy, not because they needed to, but because someone told them they could not. And that was enough. That was all the reason they required. Someone said it was impossible, and so they did it. In machines held together with metal and math and sheer stubborn refusal to accept the word no. The Dominion delegate had stopped smiling. Corvan reached into his robe and produced a small device, no larger than a stone, and he held it up for the chamber to see. I have brought the complete and fiery observational record of the species known as humanity. Every war, every famine, every plague, every act of creation, and every act of destruction, every moment we recorded over thousands of years of watching them. He activated the device, and the file transmitted to every terminal in the chamber simultaneously. "Watch it," he said, "all of it, and then tell me you still want to send a fleet to their world." He turned and began walking out of the chamber, and just before he reached the door, he stopped and spoke one last time without turning around. "We had a name for them, back when we first started watching. A classification we created just for them, because nothing else fit. We called them the species that should not exist, because everything about them defies what we know about how civilizations survive and grow and die." He paused. "The Dominion has conquered 300 worlds, and it believes that makes it strong. But I promise you this. You have never in all your long and bloody history faced anything like what is living on that little blue world. And if you are wise, we'll make sure you never do." And then he left, and the chamber sat in ringing silence, and 4,000 civilizations stared at the file blinking on their screens, and not one of them was laughing anymore. The file was enormous. It contained thousands of years of footage and data and analysis, more information than most species generated in their entire history. And it sat on the screens of 4,000 delegations like a door that no one wanted to open. The first ones to watch it were the small powers, the minor species with little influence and nothing to lose. And within hours, the whispers started, quiet and nervous, spreading through the corridors of the Concord like smoke through a ventilation system. Then the mid-tier civilizations began watching. The merchants and the traders and the old colonial powers who had once ruled their own corners of the galaxy before the Dominion swallowed their ambitions. And they watched with the careful eyes of species who understood what power looked like, because they had once had it and lost it. By the end of the first day, over half the Concord had seen at least part of the file, and something strange was happening. Hallways were quieter than they had ever been. The dining halls were half empty, and delegates who had been rivals for centuries were sitting together in silence, watching the same footage on the same screens, with the same expression on their faces: fear. The file started at the beginning, with the first Anthiri observation drones arriving in Sol system tens of thousands of years ago. And what they found was a species that should not have survived its own birth: small, soft, slow, with no claws, and no armor, and no venom, and no natural weapons of any kind, living on a world that seemed determined to kill them through ice and heat and disease and disaster. And yet they survived. The footage showed them huddled around fires in caves, while glaciers ground across the land above them, eating whatever they could find, wrapping themselves in the skins of animals that were bigger and stronger and faster than they were, animals they had hunted and killed with rocks and sharpened sticks. And the Anthiri drones recorded the temperature and the odds and the projected survival rate, which was near zero. And then they recorded the humans surviving anyway. It showed them building the first cities out of mud and stone, organizing themselves into groups, inventing language and writing and mathematics, not because some higher species taught them, but because they figured it all out on their own, piece by piece, generation by generation, through nothing but trial and error and an endless stubborn refusal to stay ignorant. Then came the wars. The Korathi delegate was the first to pause the footage and stand up from his chair, because what he was seeing did not match anything in his species' understanding of how civilizations develop. Humans were not just fighting, they were innovating their killing at a rate that the Concord's own war colleges would have called impossible. They went from stones to bronze to iron to steel in what seemed like the blink of an eye. And every time they invented a new way to destroy each other, they simultaneously invented a new way to build, to heal, to grow, as if creation and destruction were not opposites for them, but two sides of the same engine. The footage showed empires rising and falling, plagues that killed millions, famines that starved entire continents, and every single time without exception, the humans came back. Not diminished, not weakened, not humbled into submission, but angry and hungry and more determined than before. The Anthiri analysis highlighted a pattern that no other species in recorded galactic history had ever displayed. Humans did not learn caution from catastrophe. They learned ambition, and suffering did not teach them to be small. It taught them to be bigger, faster, more dangerous, more creative, more relentless. The military analysts in the Concord, the ones trained to assess threats and calculate force projections, were the ones who went quiet first, because the numbers were not just alarming, they were terrifying. Human innovation in warfare followed an exponential curve that broke every predictive model the Concord had ever used, and the Anthiri had mapped that curve with meticulous precision. From spears to cannons to bombs that could level cities to weapons that could crack the atom itself, all within a span of time so short that most galactic species would still have been arguing about whether to invent the wheel. But it was not the weapons that scared the analysts the most. It was what happened in between the wars. The footage showed a human pulling another human out of rubble after a bombing, carrying the stranger on his back through smoke and fire. Not because he knew the person, but because the person was alive and needed help. It showed a woman standing in front of a tank, alone, unarmed, refusing to move. It showed doctors traveling across oceans, treat diseases in places that had no connection to their own homes, and teachers building schools in ruins, and musicians playing instruments in buildings that were half destroyed, and children laughing in refugee camps, and a man planting a tree in a desert because he believed that someday it would grow. And the Anthiri analysis noted, in its cold and precise way, that this was the most dangerous thing about humans. Not the weapons, not the wars, not the relentless innovation, but the fact that they cared about each other, fiercely and irrationally, in ways that defied strategic logic. And that caring was the fuel that made everything else possible. A species that only knew how to fight could be outfought. A species that only knew how to build could be outbuilt. But a species that would burn the world to protect a stranger and then rebuild it with their bare hands because they believed it was worth saving, that species could not be defeated by any conventional means. Then came the projections. The Anthiri had run simulations, thousands of them, using every model and every variable and every possible scenario, and the results were displayed on a single screen, in numbers so stark and so simple that even the youngest delegate in the chamber could understand them. Scenario: Dominion fleet arrives in Sol system and initiates standard pacification protocol. Projected human response within the first 72 hours. Complete cessation of all internal conflicts. Full species-wide mobilization. Every government on the planet unified under a single defensive command structure. The delegates stared at that number, 72 hours, and many of them did not believe it, because their own species had taken decades or centuries to unify under external threat, and some had never unified at all. Projected human industrial output increase within 30 days, 300%. Projected timeline for reverse engineering captured Dominion technology, 1 generation, possibly less. Projected probability of successful Dominion subjugation of Earth, 0.02%. Projected probability that humanity, once aware of the Dominion's existence and motivated by the attack, would develop faster-than-light capability within 50 years, 89%. Projected probability that humanity would engage in retaliatory expansion within 100 years, 94%. Projected probability that humanity would dismantle the Valith Dominion entirely within 200 years, 97.3%. The numbers sat on the screen like a sentence of death, not for Earth, but for every power in the galaxy that had ever thought of itself as untouchable. Archon Sevrath Cole watched the projections from his flagship, still en route to Sol system, and for the first time in his long and blood-soaked career, he felt something cold move through his chest that he did not immediately recognize. It took him a moment to name it. It was doubt. He paused the fleet. Back in the Concorde, chaos erupted, delegates shouting over each other, some demanding that Earth be destroyed immediately before they could advance any further, others insisting on permanent quarantine, others arguing that the Anthiri projections were exaggerated and that no Tier 9 species could possibly pose that kind of threat. But underneath all the shouting, underneath all the arguments and the politics and the posturing, every single delegate in that chamber knew the same thing, even if they would not say it out loud. They were afraid. And somewhere in the noise, an independent data analyst working in the lower levels of Concorde Central pulled up the deleted flag from the scouting drones, the one that had been dismissed as cultural noise, the signal from the little golden probe spinning at the edge of Sol system. To translate it, slowly and carefully, word by word. And the more she translated, the more her hands began to shake. The analyst's name was Mirith Sohn, and she was no one important, a mid-level data processor assigned to verify scouting reports for clerical accuracy. The kind of person who spent her days buried in numbers that other people had already decided did not matter. But Mirith was thorough, and when she found the deleted flag in the Sol 3 scouting data, she did not dismiss it the way the drone AI had, because she had been trained to believe that deleted flags were often the most important ones. The signal was coming from a small object drifting at the edge of the human solar system, a metal probe, barely larger than a ground transport, covered in a golden disk that was broadcasting a repeating message on frequencies so old and so primitive that most modern receivers would not even detect it. Mirith detected it. She spent hours running it through translation algorithms, pulling apart the layers of sound and image and code. And what she found was not a weapon, not a warning, not a distress call. It was something she had never encountered in any first contact file she had ever processed. It was an invitation. She brought it to her supervisor, who brought it to his supervisor, who brought it to the Concorde Security Council, and within a day, it was scheduled to be played before the full assembly, because by now, the entire Concorde was paying attention to anything connected to Sol 3, and the fear that had been building since the Anthiri file was hungry for more information. The chamber was full when the session began, every seat occupied, every gallery packed, every screen active, and the tension in the air was so thick that even the environmental systems seemed to struggle with it. The moderator stood and announced that a previously deleted data artifact from the Sol 3 scouting report had been recovered and translated, and that it would now be presented to the assembly in its entirety. The lights dimmed, and the message began to play. First there were sounds, strange, rhythmic, layered sounds that the translation system identified as music, and it was unlike anything the Concorde had ever heard, because it was messy and emotional and completely uncontrolled, full of joy and sorrow, tangled together in ways that made no logical sense, and yet every delegate in the room felt something stir in whatever part of their biology handled feeling. Then there were images, A blue world spinning in darkness. Oceans and clouds and continents, and then closer. Faces. Dozens of faces from every corner of that world. Different colors and shapes and ages, all looking directly at the recording device, with expressions that the translation system struggled to categorize because they were too complex, too layered, too human. Then there were greetings, voices speaking in dozens of different languages, and the translation system rendered them one by one, and they all said roughly the same thing in different ways. We are the people of Earth. We send greetings from our world to yours. We wish you peace and friendship across the stars. The chamber listened in absolute silence. Then came the data, mathematical formulas, diagrams of human biology, maps of their solar system, images of their daily lives, children playing, people eating, hands touching, a woman nursing an infant, a man looking up at the night sky. And woven through all of it, more music, a piece that the translation system identified as composed by a human named Beethoven, written at a time when the composer was losing his ability to hear, created in silence by a man who refused to stop making beauty, even when his own body was taking it away from him. The Korathi delegate put his hand over his mouth. The Dominion representative stood motionless. And then at the end, there was a single spoken message, a voice, calm and warm and unmistakably aware of what it was doing, explaining what this probe was and why it had been sent. The humans had built this small machine and attached this golden record and launched it into the void, knowing full well that space was vast and cold and probably empty, knowing that the chances of anyone ever finding it were almost zero, knowing that they might be completely alone in the universe, with no one to hear them and no one to answer. And they sent it anyway, not as a surrender, not as a plea for help, not as a warning to stay away, but as a hello, a handshake extended into the darkness, a voice calling out to the unknown with no guarantee that anyone was listening. The translation of the final spoken words filled the chamber. This is a present from a small distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time, so we may live into yours. The message ended, and the silence that followed was the deepest the Concorde had ever known. It was not the silence of shock or confusion or processing. It was the silence of 4,000 civilizations, suddenly understanding something that changed everything they thought they knew about the species on Sol 3. Every other primitive world the Concorde had ever studied, every single one without exception, had reacted to the discovery of the vastness of space with fear, with silence, with withdrawal, pulling inward, hiding, making themselves as small and as quiet as possible. Because the universe was enormous and terrifying, and the rational response was to hope that nothing out there noticed you. Humanity had done the opposite. Humanity had looked into the same void, the same infinite, crushing, indifferent darkness that had silenced every other young species. And they had recorded their music, photographed their children, written down their mathematics, and launched it all into the black on a tiny golden disk. Message that said in every language they had, "Come find us." They were not afraid. That was the thing that finally broke the chamber. Not the N-theory projections, not the war footage, not the exponential innovation curves. It was this small golden record spinning in the dark, this impossible act of optimism from a species that had every reason to be terrified, and simply was not. Because a species that hides can be found, and a species that runs can be chased, and a species that fights can be beaten. But a species that reaches out its hand to the unknown and says, "Hello, here we are, come and meet us," is a species that has already decided it will not be conquered. Not by the darkness, not by the silence, not by anything. Archon Sevrath Kol stood alone on the bridge of his flagship, watching the message play on his personal screen for the third time. and his fleet hung in space behind him. Engines hot, weapons armed, 300 worlds of conquest behind him, and one small blue world ahead. He had crushed civilizations that were older and stronger, and more advanced than humanity. He had broken species that had centuries of preparation, and armies that numbered in the billions, and he had done it without hesitation, because he had always known, with absolute certainty, that he was stronger. He did not feel that certainty now. He opened a channel to the Concorde and spoke, and his voice was steady, but the words he said were words he had never spoken before in his entire career. I am withdrawing the fleet from Sol system, effective immediately. The Concorde erupted, but Cole did not wait for a vote or a debate or permission, because he had not survived 300 campaigns by ignoring his instincts, and every instinct he had was screaming the same thing. Do not touch that world. Do not provoke that species. Do not give them a reason to look up from their small blue planet and aim their terrible, beautiful, unstoppable energy at the stars. The vote came 12 hours later. Earth was removed from the harvest list, the first world in recorded history to be removed without a single weapon being fired, without a single ship being deployed, without a single human even knowing it had happened. But the vote came with a second motion, classified at the highest level, sealed and hidden from every public record. Sol system was to be quarantined, permanently, completely, absolutely. No contact, no trade, no communication, no acknowledgement. A dampening field would be erected around their solar system to absorb their radio signals before they could reach anyone, and every galactic shipping lane within 100 light-years would be rerouted to ensure that no one stumbled upon them by accident. Humanity must never know the galaxy existed, because the moment they knew, the moment they looked up and saw that a void they had been calling out to was full of life and power and civilizations that had tried to erase them, the clock would start, and no one in the Concorde wanted to find out what happened when it reached zero. The quarantine held. For years it held, and then for decades, and then for what felt like a long exhale across the entire galaxy. And during that time, life on Earth continued exactly the way it always had, loud and messy and full of contradiction, with humans fighting and loving and building and breaking in equal measure, completely unaware that the greatest power in the galaxy had looked at them and flinched. They did not know that their radio signals were being swallowed by an invisible wall before they could travel more than a few light years. They did not know that shipping lanes had been bent around their solar system like a river diverted around a stone. And they did not know that their name had become the most whispered word in the Concorde chambers. Not spoken in contempt anymore, but in something closer to reverence, or maybe something closer to dread. The galaxy, meanwhile, was changing. It started small, a few delegates from minor species raising questions about the harvest list during routine sessions, asking whether certain worlds might be better left alone, pointing out that the Amphirai projections for Earth raised uncomfortable questions about other species that had been marked for conquest. The Dominion dismissed these questions the way it always had, with silence and authority. But the questions did not stop, they only multiplied, because the Amphirai file had been leaked within weeks of the emergency session, copied and transmitted through back channels and underground networks, until it became the most viewed document in galactic history. Everyone saw it, the wars, the plagues, the atomic fire, the music, the golden record, the projections, and everyone drew their own conclusions, and those conclusions were not kind to the Dominion. If one Tier 9 world could project that kind of threat, what about the species on Vorath 7, the ones the Dominion had classified as a moderate resistance? What about the aquatic civilization on Sin Okara? What about all the worlds that had been harvested over the centuries, the ones that were already gone? How many of them might have been something extraordinary if they had been left alone? The questions were dangerous, and the Dominion knew it. But the Dominion had been built on the idea that the strong conquered the weak, and that this was the natural order of things. And the Anthiri file had introduced a crack in that idea, that no amount of force could seal. Because humanity had not proven that they were stronger than the Dominion, they had proven something much worse. They had proven that strength was not what the Dominion thought it was. Strength was not fleets, or weapons, or territory, or the ability to crush a weaker species into submission. Strength was the thing that made a dying composer write music he would never hear. The thing that made a woman stand in front of a tank. The thing that made a species look into an empty universe and say hello instead of hiding. And if that was what strength really looked like, then the Dominion was not strong at all. It was just big, and those were not the same thing. The harvest list grew shorter each cycle, not dramatically, not enough to call it a revolution, but enough to notice, enough to matter, and the Dominion's grip on the Concord loosened by fractions each year, like a fist slowly opening, not because anyone forced it open, but because the fingers were tired, and the reasons for holding on were no longer convincing. Archon Sevrath Cole retired from military service, the first fleet commander in Dominion history to do so voluntarily, and he never spoke publicly about his decision to withdraw from Sol system. But those who knew him said he was different afterward, quieter, more careful with his words, as if he had seen something that rearranged the furniture inside his mind, and he was still figuring out where everything went. The Anthiri returned to their silence, role in the great disruption complete, and Elder Corvan went back to his deep chamber beneath the surface of Anthira and resumed his watching, because that was what the Anthiri did. They watched, and they waited, and they remembered. But before he left the Concord for the last time, Corvan did one final thing that no one noticed at the time, but that would matter more than anything else he had ever done. He set an alarm. It was a simple thing, a monitoring program linked to the quarantine field around Sol System, designed to alert him if the field was ever disturbed from the inside, and he buried it so deep in the Anthiri network that no one else would ever find it. And then he went home and sat down and waited. On Earth, the decades turned, and humanity kept doing what humanity did. They fought new wars and ended old ones. They built new technologies and abandoned outdated ones. They argued about politics and religion and the meaning of life and whether pineapple belonged on pizza, and through it all they kept looking up, kept reaching, kept asking the same question they had been asking since the first human looked at the night sky and wondered what was out there. They developed new theories about faster-than-light travel, not from captured alien technology, not from secret government programs, but from pure mathematics and stubborn curiosity, the same tools that had carried them from caves to skyscrapers, from campfires to nuclear reactors, from wooden boats to the surface of the moon. They argued about those theories for years, debated them in universities and laboratories and late-night conversations, tested them and failed and tested them again, because that was what humans did. They failed and they tried again, and the failure never stopped them. It only made the success sweeter. And then one day, in a laboratory that was too small and too underfunded and too far from the centers of power to be taken seriously, a team of scientists who had been told their work was impossible turned on a machine that bent space itself, and for exactly 1.7 seconds, something moved faster than light. The celebration was enormous, the implications were staggering, and the world changed overnight, the way it always changed when humans did something impossible. With excitement and fear and argument and wonder, all tangled together in that uniquely human way that no other species in the galaxy had ever been able to replicate. Within a decade, they built the first ship capable of leaving Sol system. It was not elegant, it was clunky and over-engineered, and covered in backup systems for backup systems, because humans did not trust the universe to be kind, and they prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. and it was named after one of their ancient explorers. Because that was another thing about humans. They carried their history with them everywhere they went, refused to put down because it reminded them of who they were. The crew was small, 7 people chosen from thousands of volunteers, every one of them knowing that they might not come back, every one of them choosing to go anyway because the question of what was out there was louder than the fear of what might happen. The ship launched from Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning, and billions of people watched it go, and some of them cried, and some of them cheered, and some of them simply stood in silence with their faces turned toward the sky, watching the tiny bright point of light that carried their species' oldest dream into the darkness. The ship crossed the orbit of Mars in hours, passed Jupiter in days, and sailed beyond Pluto into the deep black where no human had ever gone. And the crew watched their instruments and talked quietly among themselves, and tried not to think about how small they were against the enormity of everything. And then, at the very edge of Sol's system, something appeared on the sensors that should not have been there. It was faint at first, a shimmer, a distortion, like heat rising off a road on a summer day, except there was no heat and no road, just the cold vacuum of space, and something invisible pressing against it from the outside. Lieutenant Commander Anya Voss, no relation to any Dominion officer, though the universe has a sense of humor about names, was the first to notice it, and she stared at her screen for a long time before she said anything, because what she was seeing did not match any natural phenomenon she had ever studied. "There is something here," she said, and her voice was calm, but her hands were not. The rest of the crew gathered around her station, and they looked at the readings, and they ran diagnostics, and they checked and double-checked, and the shimmer was still there, a wall, invisible and enormous, stretching in every direction as far as their instruments could see, surrounding their entire solar system, like a fence around a yard. They did not know what it was, they did not know who had built it, and they did not know why, but they knew with absolute certainty that it was not natural, that someone had put it there on purpose, and that it was meant to keep something in, or keep something out. Anya reached for the comm to transmit her findings back to Earth, and her hand was steady now, because the initial shock had passed, and in its place was something that the Anthiri would have recognized immediately if they had been watching. Not fear, not hesitation, not the urge to turn around and go home, but curiosity, deep and burning and completely unstoppable. She pressed the transmit button. Across the galaxy, in the deep chamber beneath the surface of Anthira, an alarm chimed. Soft, simple, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for wind if you were not listening for it. Elder Koravan opened his 4 ancient eyes, and he looked at the alert, and he read the data, and for a long time he simply sat there, feeling the weight of all those centuries of watching pressing down on him like gravity. "They have found the fence," he murmured to the empty room. He closed his eyes again, and his breathing was slow, and when he spoke, his voice held no surprise, and no anger, and no panic, only the deep, tired acceptance of someone who had always known this moment would come. It was never going to hold forever, and somewhere, at the edge of a small solar system, 7 humans stared at the wall that the galaxy had built to contain them, and not one of them suggested turning back.